Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you could come, and it's great to see so many familiar faces here. For anybody who may not know me, I'm Mark Stout. I'm the director of the MA in Global Security Studies here, from which I see both current students and also some alums as well. But I'm merely the supporting cast today, and we are very fortunate to welcome Dr. Joana Cook, who is a senior research fellow for the International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College in London, where her research focuses particularly on women in violent extremism, countering violent extremism, and counterterrorism practices in the Middle East and North Africa, especially Yemen, as I understand it. Here at Hopkins, she also teaches the course which is running this semester, as a matter of fact, Radicalization and De-radicalization in Terror Networks. Dr. Cook is also a research affiliate with the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and Society. And she's done many things, but one other that I'll highlight is she's also worked in the past as a journalist, both in Canada and in Africa. Dr. Cook holds a BA in Political Science from the University of Regina in Saskatchewan and an MA in Conflict, Security, and Development from King's College London, and she also did her PhD at King's College in the Department of War Studies. And the book we're here to talk about today, which you can see right here, it's a very elegant book, is her book, A Woman's Place, U.S. Counterterrorism Since 9/11, which was published, correct me if I'm wrong, but 5 days ago, I think, by Oxford University Press. That's what Amazon said. Yeah. And which is derived from her PhD work. So first off, congratulations on, I know producing books is no fun whatsoever, so I applaud anybody who's got the fortitude to see it through, and welcome to Johns Hopkins.
Thank you so much.
So let's just start with sort of how this project came to be. So you're a Canadian. You work at a university in the UK, and you wrote a book about women and U.S. counterterrorism. So how did this project come about? What was the genesis of this?
So, I've had this funny reflection now that a lot of the students coming into my classroom it's that generational shift now where so many of them are so young that they either don't directly remember 9/11 or some of them weren't even born yet, right?
I find that really depressing. But
it makes me feel old. But what it also highlights is just, I was in my high school classroom in Saskatchewan watching the Twin Towers go down, and the way that you've just seen international security evolve so much based on the events of that day has always really kind of jumped out at me. And I've always had an interest in women in relation to conflict and in solving conflict. And, the one area that I continuously saw that it was not being looked at was in relation to 9/11. We saw counterterrorism evolving in such new ways and reaching every corner of the earth, and it was being documented left, right, and center. But I felt there was a real gap in terms of analyzing women's roles throughout this entire space, how women were acting in counterterrorism forces, how they were being impacted by this work, how they themselves were becoming terrorist actors in some cases. And so this book was really an attempt to kind of look at that period very holistically. And so I look at counterterrorism from 2001 to 2019, early 2019.
So one thing I thought was novel and I thought rather bold, I mean that in a good way, not maybe in the way that a Brit might mean that word, was that you're not only looking at the role of women in American counterterrorism efforts, but you're also looking at the role of women in groups like Al-Qaeda and the ISIS world and that sort of thing. Why did you do that? I mean, as somebody who hasn't done this work, that would sound to me like that's just two very different groups. And but yeah. So how did that come about?
Well, and I think that's still the general way of thinking. But if you think about it, it's how we understand terrorism and terrorist groups that we directly shape our practices to. Those counterterrorism practices, those CVE practices, are directly shaped and informed by how we understand those terrorist groups and their strategies, their tactics, their objectives, their ideologies, and so forth. And there were so many interesting cases where the direct actions of groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS in relation to women were actually directly informing counterterrorism work.
Can you give a, for instance?
Absolutely. So 2003 in Iraq, all of a sudden you see an uptick in female insurgents. You see women starting to move goods between checkpoints. And then we saw Al-Qaeda in Iraq under Zarqawi in particular start deploying female suicide bombers. There wasn't a capability to search local women and engage with local women. And so we saw the establishment of Team Lioness, for example. So this was the first kind of all-female unit that was set up in Iraq specifically to engage with local women. For another example is as we saw thousands of women from around the world start to go and join ISIS, all of a sudden we had to really think a lot more about how women became relevant in CVE work, or was the CVE programming being done considering women adequately. And so it was also the actions of women in relation to these terrorist groups that in some cases were prompting responses or changes as well.
So you use this phrase early on in the book, women as agents, partners, and targets of counterterrorism. Can you tell us a little bit about what each of those three words means before we really get into the guts of what you're doing here?
Yeah, and so by saying agents, partners, and targets, I think it really kind of encapsulates the three primary categories of women that we looked at in this period, right? So women as agents in all aspects of U.S. government. So these were women as U.S. soldiers, women working in the diplomatic corps, or women, female diplomats, women working in USAID, but women that were specifically working within these three departments and agency.
And those are Defense, State, and USAID.
Correct.
Okay.
And so I've got a separate chapter on each of those in the book. And so it was looking at what their roles were in this period and how some of the programming related to women in those three agencies evolved. The second one was women as partners. And so this was looking specifically at women in Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen. And, you know, when we're looking at things like training and equipping programs or stabilization programs or CVE programs, how were women being engaged as partners in those countries or as communities of interest to reach out to? And then as targets, because we did see women come up in Al-Qaeda and women coming up in ISIS. And in fact, women were increasingly targeted within terrorist groups themselves.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you did this work and what kind of source materials you were using? And then we'll go to like, what did you do specifically and what did you find? But
absolutely,
yeah.
And you're stuck with the methodology question because it's a university here. But
well, I'm geeky enough; I would find it interesting anyway. But all right.
Yeah, no, I'm kidding. Yeah. I reviewed over 500 U.S. documents, strategies, policy frameworks, speeches, and statements, anything that was being produced by either those three departments and agency, but also looking at the presidential level. So how were Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump talking about women in relation to counterterrorism? How did they see that terrorist threat, and what role did women play also in their discourses in terms of countering them? And so I reviewed those 500 plus documents. I conducted about 40 elite interviews with actors along the way and kind of pulled it all together and created a framework to really try and analyze that a little bit more into detail.
So let's talk a little bit about that framework. And one of the things I really love about this book is its ambition. I counted something like 18 variables in 3 different categories you're working with. So it's the result, though. I mean, so there's a lot of moving parts here. But I think looking at this, that the result is that you've really been successful in being able to deal with and describe and categorize a vast range of phenomena. So do you want to talk a little bit about your overall framework for analysis, and we'll drill down into some of that. But
yeah, of course. So the framework essentially looks at 3 distinct categories here. So it looks, 3 distinct areas. The first is the categories that women were often referenced in. Women were referenced in terms of victimhood. They were referenced as security actors. They were referenced in terms of rights and empowerment. But there were 7 kind of general categories that we often saw women being referenced to in relation to counterterrorism. The second category that I looked at in this framework was the factors that were really impacting how or why these were evolving on the ground. So, for example, you look at, again, things like the actions that were being taken by terrorist groups against women or utilizing women, and what this was prompting in terms of counterterrorism responses. But it also looked at things like changing operational objectives on the ground. 18 years in a country like Yemen, Afghanistan, or Iraq, a lot changed on the ground. And whether it was a rise in insurgency and the utilization of counterinsurgency doctrine, or again things like populations of foreigners going over to Iraq and Syria, those changing operational objectives of the day also meant that a lot of these policies in relation to women evolved with that. And the final thing that I looked at was the justifications often stated for why women were being included. And this really spoke to the kind of motivations of each agency to include women in their programming. So it talked about women in terms of like the operational benefits that would be derived from including women in that programming. What operational benefit was there to be had by either including women or setting up a new unit for women or program that focused on women. But it also talked about things like women as half the population. So the idea that just by default to being half the population, you did have to engage them. You had to consider them and reflect their needs, concerns, and so forth in your operations if you wanted them to be as effective as possible.
So your first category, or your first sort of set of considerations here then is sort of categories of women in the discourse. So the obvious one, which you have first, is security practitioners. I mean, I think anybody reading the title of your book, that's the first thing that would come to mind. There's some others here that I thought were really interesting and that I wouldn't necessarily have thought about before. So one of them is members of the public or the local community. And as a former intelligence officer, I was particularly interested in that category.
Yeah.
So do you want to elaborate a little bit on, like, how what that means in your work?
Absolutely. And so, for example, you're in a place like Afghanistan, and all of a sudden you're facing a growing insurgency. Counterterrorism still plays a component within counterinsurgency work as well, and they often interact. But all of a sudden, as you're dealing with counterinsurgency on the ground now, you have to think about how you win the hearts and minds of that population, right? And so all of a sudden, that community of interest includes local women in a way that perhaps wasn't there before. But also local women in terms of how you could attain cooperation, how you could gain information, gain access to those communities, or at least better understand them. So when you were conducting your operations, again, you had a better sense of what was happening, what some of the implications of your practices were, and so forth.
Well, in those particular cases, then, are those things then that circle back to security practitioners? Or did we find in the places that the U.S. military was operating those roles of relating to and working with and hopefully persuading and also in some ways exploiting for information those women, required that work to be done by American women or by coalition women, or was that something that men could do? How did those two categories of practitioner and then member of the local community sort of interact with each other?
Yeah, and so you think about the specific operational locations in these countries, right? So you look at Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen, and these all tend to be a bit more gender segregated in the public. And, it's going to be very different if you're conducting operations in somewhere like, Korea or Brazil or, somewhere in Europe. But because of the highly gender segregated nature of these countries, it meant that in order to access women or interact with women, and particularly in very sensitive activities like body searches or home raids or searches, it meant you had to have women doing that, or it was completely culturally inappropriate and, in fact, really giving you a lot of problems at the end of the day.
One of your other categories here was the private domestic sphere.
Yeah, and so this becomes very prominent when we're talking about countering violent extremism. And so this is where the idea of women in the household, women as mothers, women as wives, can play a role countering violent extremism in their family. And this was something that came up a lot, more prominently, again, in response to ISIS. It was a slightly problematic category, too, though, because often you would have kind of idealized roles for women, or the idea that women could only be mothers in their family, or really promoted only as mothers in certain cases. But simultaneously, some of this work was, again, doing things like neglecting the role of fathers in CVE work as well, or only supporting women in certain or limited roles within the family. And so this was really focusing particularly on women's roles in their kind of domestic sphere, in that household approach, and, again, usually as kind of wives and mothers.
Well, I was going to come to this a little bit later, but since you raise it, so back, 10 years ago when I worked in the jihadist studies world, that's a long time in the past, but I ran across at that time sort of basically Al-Qaeda 2.0 and that community talking a lot amongst themselves about how, gosh, we're just not getting young men to join our movement in part because of wives and mothers, right, who are not encouraging them and who are providing, loving, nice homes for them to be in that seem a whole lot nicer than going off and fighting in some unpleasant battlefield and dying a scary death. So your answer just now was talking, if I understood you, largely about sort of the blue side of thinking about this private domestic sphere. But did you see those sorts of concerns in your work that I did 10, 12 years ago?
Absolutely. And this was interesting because in all three of these countries, we saw non-state actors directly recruiting, particularly from female-headed households. And so, for example, in Yemen, when there were cases of female-headed households where the male breadwinner had been killed in a drone strike, or again, looking in a country like Afghanistan where the male breadwinner had been killed in conflict there, you often had these female-led households that had very dire prospects ahead of them, and often they were directly targeted by insurgent groups. We saw AQAP supporting some of these families and directly recruiting from them. We saw this similar in Iraq, and you can bet your bottom dollar that this is something that's very much happening now in relation to ISIS.
One of your other big categories, your second sort of category of factors you looked at was, factors that impacted how the evolution of women's roles. And a little bit to my surprise, you talk here about international discourse, particularly the United Nations.
Yeah.
If I was just sort of thinking about this sort of on the basis of no research, I would not immediately have thought about the UN in this context. So why does that matter here?
Yeah, so we're talking the most meta level here, right? The largest macro level here. But what we really saw at the UN level were some of those international discourses really shaping the roles of women on an international level. And so a number of examples of these, 1325, or UN Security Council Resolution 1325, is their landmark resolution on women, peace, and security. That document directly informed the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security in 2011, and that led to the institutionalization of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda within state, USAID, and Department of Defense, all of which trickled down into counterterrorism and countering violent extremism work. But also when we start getting to ISIS kind of by 2014, we see resolutions like 2242 coming up as well, where we talk about ISIS families, and we start talking a little bit more about the roles of women as potential combatants as well, or their roles in political violence more generally, I should say. But it was interesting to look at those international discourses because it really kind of shaped the global norms pertaining to women's roles in international security, some of which the U.S. directly pulled off of or reflected in their own work, some of which didn't seem to resonate as much.
One of the other things you talk about in this context of like factors that impacted the evolution of women's roles was sort of the agency environment, so back in the U.S. government, right?
Yeah.
And I think everyone here is familiar with the kinds of limitations that exist and have existed in the Defense Department, for instance, or particularly in the actual uniformed military, limits on women in combat roles, more recently, sort of back and forth on whether transgender women can or cannot serve, those sorts of things. Have analogous kinds of limitations been important in state and USAID? And if so, how? Money.
Budgets.
Okay.
If you are talking about budgetary constraints, if you're operating in an environment where counterterrorism is the primary foreign policy issue of the day, if you're running a development program in Yemen, if you're running a stabilization program in Afghanistan, if you're doing a CVE program in another country, or any kind of work, unless there becomes a direct, for many of the, for example, I talked about 4 U.S. ambassadors to Yemen about some of the work that they were doing there. And the one thing that became increasingly clear is that a lot of the development work that was very positive in the community, that was writ large contributing to stabilization and a more secure society, was increasingly having to be framed in terms of how it countered extremism, because they just couldn't get funding from Washington unless it demonstrated very clearly that there was a counterterrorism function here. You can't just send girls.
Ate everything.
You can't just send girls to school because it's a good idea or it's positive for that community. It had to be demonstrated in terms of how it was contributing to or countering extremism. And I think this became a big limitation or a very kind of problematic aspect of this campaign over the years, because it also meant that some of these issues that were viewed traditionally as humanitarian work or development work increasingly became viewed in terms of countering extremism. And that could actually start putting some of the people working on those programs in danger. Or, for example, if the threat from terrorism was looked at reducing in there, sometimes the funding for those programs would also go down.
So it's not in the first instance about limitations per se on the roles of women in state or women in AID. Yeah. It's more on programmatic things that would use women as agents, partners, and targets, particularly the partners and targets, I guess.
Yeah, another kind of limitation I found was that each institution had a different kind of history of not only women's roles within their institution, but how gender became relevant to their work or not, or the kind of knowledge of things like gender dynamics. And I'll give you an example of this. Since 1979 in the Percy Amendment, USAID has had to, in every program that they do, consider gendered impacts. So gender is inherent in the kind of work they do day to day. When they're putting a development program here, how does it impact men? How does it impact women? When you get to DOD, that knowledge isn't there, or it has not traditionally been there. It's catching up a little bit now, but that lack of gender knowledge meant that actually a lot of the operations on the ground or operations that were being conducted, you didn't have quite as clear a sense as to how they might be impacting populations of men and women differently, or what implications were coming out of those programs.
Interesting. Okay. So then on your third category, justifications for including women in the efforts, whether it's the blue side efforts or the bad guy efforts. So I think you mentioned, one example of some things that women on the blue side could do that men couldn't, searching females, for instance. Yeah. Are there others there? And also on the terrorist side, how did they think about sort of operations and innovation and, using, perhaps the right verb maybe would be exploiting women?
Mm-hmm. Well, so for example, I think Team Lioness is a really interesting one because the direct function or capability of that unit was that they could then search women and actually find female insurgents. They could stop the movement of some of these goods. They could identify female suicide bombers, or in these communities actually have a chance to talk with Iraqi women and get a sense of, are Iraqi women seeing something different that the men might not be? And female engagement teams were doing something similar as well over in Afghanistan. And so we did see some of these units get set up with that specific aim of either more directly engaging that community, getting a better sense of that other half of the population, some of their needs and concerns. But there was also a very clear justification in terms of how it improved their operations, how it improved their kind of understanding of that landscape and that population that they were engaging, and was demonstrated to actually help them achieve their goals at the end of the day.
The United States military likes to operate on data.
Yes.
Were those kind of efforts ones that they were able to quantify as being effective? Now, I'm not one of those people who believe that if you can't quantify it, it doesn't matter. Very much not so. But I'm just sort of curious. It seems to me that the standing of programs like female engagement teams, for instance, would be a whole lot stronger if they were able to put up the the PowerPoint slide with the graph with the the line going near vertical and that sort of thing. Were they able to make those kinds of arguments? Or is it more like this is a good thing, we can't quantify it, but obviously it's a good thing?
Yeah, I think it was a very difficult thing to quantify, and some of the concerns that came up with these programs was that what their aims were was not always as clear in practice. So it's like you had to engage those female communities, great, but then what? So what kind of institutional support would you have to actually implement change there, or to support certain needs or concerns that Afghan women were facing? So you now had a unit that could actually engage those communities and get a sense of what women were thinking on the ground, get a better sense of that. But what power did they have to actually shape or programming? What resources were behind that? Those were some of the limitations that started coming up. And I think it really, in some cases, limited the effectiveness of those units. But it was interesting talking with, looking at the kind of stories of women that were joining these units. The one thing that always really jumped out was that they did it because they wanted to create a positive change in that community. They wanted to work with those women. They wanted to do something positive. But I think institutionally there were a lot of limitations in terms of what they could actually achieve, and a sense of how was that unit or what its aim was contributing to the wider goals in that space. So I think sometimes there was a bit of a disconnect between, you have this unit and it's great, we've got this capability now, but actually what is its aim in a wider sense, and how is it contributing to our activities in the country?
You also talk about, under justifications, women's rights.
Yes.
You want to expand on that a little bit? I thought this was interesting.
Yeah. So when we talk about women's rights here, it's for a large period of this kind of global war on terror, there was this idea that the introduction of democracy was really a key way to counter extremism in a lot of these countries. And then all of a sudden it meant things like the status of women's rights and women's empowerment became also framed in terms of how it was contributing to state stability, and therefore how it was countering extremism. And so it was really interesting that actually a lot of women's rights programming or narratives about women's rights were being utilized in this. Or you'd create, for example, a program like the Daughters of Iraq program, where you would train up Iraqi women and you'd help them get these roles in the forces there. But you would also frame that as a rights thing. You were helping give women rights or have them build their rights within Iraqi society themselves. So it also became used as a bit of a justification at times for why you would establish a program. An all-female lead counterterrorism unit in Yemen, for example, this was also viewed as giving women rights in that society as well, or helping build up their rights. Like I'm saying all of these with a nuance, and I'm not saying a lot of these programs are not problematic, but those were the kind of discourses being used around women for some of those specific programs.
What do you mean some of them were problematic?
A lot of the programs that I looked at, particularly in whether, again, it was that all-female elite counterterrorism unit, whether it was things like the Daughters of Iraq program, or training up women in the Afghan National Police Force, the Afghan National Army, or in specific units like the family support platoons, the consistent funding and institutional support of those units was very, very sporadic, and often they kind of fell off the map and just dissipated after a certain period of time. So while it was great to kind of stand up some of these units, the long-term institutional support and integration of these into broader security operations and security institutions is something that's still very much lacking.
So if, God forbid, we were have to do similar operations in 5 or 6 years, like we wouldn't necessarily automatically, institute these kinds of sort of hard-won lessons, or?
I think if you went back...
Because I know, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I guess another aspect of that is there seems to be a lot of feeling that the U.S. military is quasi-purposely forgetting what it knows about, at least about counterinsurgency, maybe not CT. So
institutional memory is something that is so relevant to looking at this topic, because I think there were some very hard-learned lessons along the way, and again, some very valuable lessons that were learned. And how you take that knowledge, again, from a specific unit that was set up in a place like Afghanistan, or something that was learned in operations in Yemen, and how you kind of centralize that or integrate that and forward it into kind of current thinking when we're looking at new trends. I think there's still a lot of issues with that in terms of how we take those lessons learned and integrate that institutionally a bit more.
So let's take the last few minutes before we open up for questions and talk then a little bit about sort of your bottom line findings. And I think you sort of opened the door there for, just a minute or two on the terrorist side, right? So you were noting, like, Afghanistan is not Iraq, is not, wherever, is not Yemen. And that was one thing I wondered about with your work. So as you're looking across the United States national security community, all right, we're all Americans, and, the headquarters of all these agencies are here inside the Beltway, and there's a lot of sort of commonality. But in the Sunni jihadist world, there's enormous cultural diversity. Even among Arabs, right? There's enormous diversity. So I'm curious to what extent you thought you could actually make generalizations about women in the Sunni jihadist terrorist world. Yeah.
So the two groups I looked at predominantly were Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and I'll just talk about one of the really, really interesting findings that I found. So I've told you about some of the discourses we use in relation to women. We talked about women's rights. We talked about women's empowerment. We talked about women's victimhood, how women were sometimes victimized by these groups. But in fact, a lot of the time, these were the exact same discourses that these groups were using. They were talking about how women were being victimized in the West. They were talking about how women could actually come over to ISIS in Iraq and Syria and regain their rights. They used a specific language. And it became very interesting seeing this kind of, when you're able to look at these discourses related to women side by side, in many cases we were using very comparable language, obviously for very different purposes, but at the end of the day, there was a shared kind of set of discourses that both we were using and that they were using. I think that's one of the really interesting reasons why perhaps some of the messaging or some of the propaganda that ISIS was putting out was really so effective in attracting women from very diverse backgrounds to go, as you said, and go travel to a conflict zone in Iraq and Syria.
Interesting. Okay. So let's turn to the U.S. side. And in the interest of time, we'll talk about state and defense. And if somebody wants to ask about USAID and questions, I'd certainly encourage that. Mm-hmm. But, at the 30,000-foot levels, what kind of changes did you observe over time in the Defense Department?
Yeah. I think the biggest one was really that opening up of combat roles to women. And I think that was directly because...
And remind me when that happened.
2015.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and so it was directly those wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the increasingly visible sacrifice and work that women were making across this whole space that it was finally recognized. And, it's only taken up until 2015 to make this happen, but, for years now, women have been... whether they've been nurses, whether they've been doing logistics, transport, regardless of what other roles they had in the military, there's not a clear front line anymore. It's not a traditional battlefield where you have us here, them there. And women were increasingly inadvertently on the front lines, and those roles meant that you had to really recognize the situation at hand, the sacrifices that women were making, and really give that kind of institutional recognition and support that female veterans needed.
What did you see in the State Department?
State Department, there was some really interesting, and this again depended very much on which administration was in office, but I think one of the things that really jumped out at me under the Obama administration in particular was that they instituted the first National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. That was instigated at the national level here, but in State Department, it was institutionalized in a way that I think really outdid every other department we were looking at. And what that meant was that across State Department, for the Obama administration, you saw considerations of women in relation to peace and security integrated full stop throughout. And that meant that when you were doing diplomatic work, when you were liaising with foreign police forces, when you were doing community engagement programs, there was an increased recognition of why gender dynamics might matter in that space or how you could better engage women in that space. I think that was something very encouraging under State Department at that time.
Given that President Trump is a whole lot less popular among female voters in the United States than among male voters, has there been any kind of change of direction, or, to use a value-laden term, maybe retrogression under the Trump administration, or has this all been sort of fairly much along a straight line?
Yeah, it's been interesting because I think one of the ways you can really measure how much women's status in relation to security becomes visible across each administration is you look at the national security strategies. And so if you look at the national security strategies under Bush, women get some limited discussion. They're highlighted in certain areas, but it is, again, fairly limited. You get to the Obama administration, and I think it was over 50 references to women and gender in the first national security strategy and even more in the second one. You get to the Trump administration national security strategy, and I think it was about 8 references. You don't reference gender. Women are talked about in very limited terms. And I think when you look at some of the programming that has come out under this administration, or particularly programming that has had its funding cut or personnel a little bit more limited, you can see that a lot of the programs that have been impacted under this administration, I think, have really kind of limited some of the progress that has been made in the last few years under this. One thing I will say, though, is that one of the long-standing efforts that has been made in this field is the Women, Peace the National Action Women, Peace and Security Act. Sorry, a lot of acronyms I just keep going over here. But the Women, Peace and Security Act did come in 2017, and that means there is now a piece of law that you can look at to make that women, peace and security agenda relevant to your own work. And so that is something that it's a really slow-moving institutional, it's very slow-moving institutionally right now, but it is something that has come up in recent years that does still have a lot of momentum or possibility in this space, I think.
Last 2 questions. Any policy prescriptions come out of your work? I mean, this is a very impressive piece of academic work. If I worked at the White House or the Defense Department or whatever, is there anything I could do with this?
Yeah, so I think that framework, I tried to create the framework in a way that makes it a tool for looking at different countries and spaces and thinking, why might women be becoming visible in certain categories, or what might be impacting changes to that? And it really helps us think through the kind of implications of programming as well, I think. But one of the easiest, it's not something that costs billions of dollars, it's something that can be really, really seamlessly integrated into a lot of our work, is just including a gender lens a little bit more. And so
just explicitly thinking about it. Is that what you mean?
Just making it more relevant, right? Mm-hmm. So, whether it's conducting a counterinsurgency operation here, whether it's in a community engagement program there, whether it's CVE work here, thinking about how, where, and why do women's roles matter in this space? How might that be different than men? And why may that be different country to country or space to space? Just thinking a little bit more about what your work does that can impact men and women differently, and really thinking about either the consequences or the benefits from shaping programming accordingly.
So last question before we open it up to the audience, and it's sort of an unfair question, as I'm going to ask you about work you haven't done. Yeah. But just intuitively, do you feel like your findings about the U.S. would translate to Britain or to Canada, or for that matter to Australia or New Zealand, or are there obvious factors that, no, I would have reason to think that would be different?
Mm-hmm. If you take that framework and you use that as a lens to look at somewhere like New Zealand or China or Brazil, wherever, that framework itself, I think, gives you a nice roadmap for thinking about how, where, or why women become represented in relation to counterterrorism, what that actually looks like in policy, what that means in practice on the ground. And so that is something that I really tried to make useful in the book, that framework where you can really start thinking in more complex but structured terms about what does it actually mean to have women in relation to counterterrorism in these places and spaces, and how can we do it better? How can we improve our practices and work together a little bit more, particularly in interagency efforts, or working with partners on the ground more to really do better in this space?
Okay. Well, I've monopolized your time here, and we've got plenty of time for questions from the audience. Kimberly has very kindly agreed to run the mic for us, but she also has the right to ask questions. So if you have one now, go for it. If you don't have one now, feel free to jump in whenever one occurs to you. And Tasha, where's Tasha? There's Tasha. Tasha can convey to us, anytime Tasha has a question from internet land, raise your hand and I'll call on you. So any questions out here? I'm sure there must be many. Come. All right, we'll go with Tasha. Tasha, the mic is on the way.
Oh, and if I could maybe just get a sense of who's asking the question so I know who I'm talking to, if that's okay.
We may or may not be able to do that for the online questions.
Right.
I'm not sure, but no.
No, okay.
I don't have that for the first question, but the first question says, thank you, great event, you're amazing. That was my bit. But can you please discuss the different types of pull factors that Daesh or ISIS has used, especially in recruiting women? And also, what type of roles do women who travel to Iraq or Syria, what do they fill?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question, and this was one of the really tough, hard-learned lessons that we've had. You know, a lot of me and my colleague Gina Vale at ICSR put together the first global data set of women minors and total populations to go over to Iraq and Syria and those that have returned. And we showed that over 6,000 women went globally, at least 13%, but we think that's still a big underestimation because there were so many countries that didn't even have information on this space. And you know, if there was one thing that became very, very apparent is that there was not a single set of pull factors for any of these women. And you can't talk about pull factors without also talking about push factors. So it goes two ways. You've got to think about what individual circumstance that person was living in, what their motivations were to change that situation and go into a different group, to change their life, to go to that specific ideology and ISIS, the pull factors, so the kind of draws and narratives that ISIS would use to recruit people. But in terms of some of the pull factors we saw, particularly for women coming from the West, you know, whether it was increasing focus on things like niqab bans or feeling like, you know, you look at, if you look at xenophobic attacks, even in places like the UK, a majority of them, those that have a kind of an Islamophobic appeal or an Islamophobic focus, you know, women, particularly those that wear visible religious symbols, tend to be overrepresented in how they're targeted by some of these groups and individuals. And that has significant implications for how one can feel like they belong in a community and their kind of sense of identity. But also, if for many of these women, I think a lot of them were really questioning what their place was in that society. And ISIS was simultaneously building what they represented as a caliphate, this new state-building project where they could go. And ISIS was using narratives like you could come regain your rights, you know, and they use that kind of language. And simultaneously, you can come over, you can get free healthcare, you can get education, and you can get a husband if you want to. But for many of these women, I think not only feeling like they perhaps didn't have a sense of belonging within their community, but motivations from being able to go and attain those services, a sense of adventure for some of them, the same that many young men felt, but also, you know, an idea that you could contribute to something bigger than yourself. I think those were some of the motivations that might have been similar to some women around the world. But again, you've really got to look at those on kind of an individual level because they were so diverse for such diverse women that went.
Did you feel like this appeal had sort of differential impact in different, say, European countries? Like, was the phenomenon the same in Britain as in France, as in Germany, as in Poland, or wherever?
You know, the highest, if I remember correctly, in Western Europe, the highest number of females that went over to join ISIS was from France. And the the public debates about things like niqab bans, whether it was like the burkini debates on the beach, like I think there was so much focus on such a limited population, and I think that did probably generate a lot of grievance in some circles, but it did go beyond that as well. It was, I think that was probably one of the biggest distinctions in the case of France that really made it such a high contributor of foreigners to ISIS.
Okay. Elizabeth, yeah. Wait for the microphone.
I'll use it. Okay. Thank you so much. It was really interesting. I'm interested in the...
Sorry, could you
Oh.
introduce your...
Sorry. I'm Elizabeth, and I'm an alumni, and I now work in corporate security. So I was interested in the difference in the treatment of women between Islamic extremist groups. So you have groups like ISIS that actually treat women sort of like agents. They use them as fighters. But then you have groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria who primarily use women as tools. And I was just wondering in your research if you came across reasons why there might be that type of disparity between them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really great question. And I think this is something that you can, it's a really useful lens to look at terrorist groups more broadly. You know, even though groups like Boko Haram and ISIS all have the same kind of ideological leaning, you know, you've got to think also about what tactics, strategies, and objectives these groups have. And in the case of ISIS, because they were a state-building project, what that meant was that they needed women in these diverse roles to deal with other women in the community. They set up things like the Al-Hansa Brigade in Raqqa so they could have women policing other women. They drew women with medical degrees so they could treat other women in the healthcare system that they set up. Boko Haram does not appear to have that same ambition, so they are not portraying the state-building project in the same way. And so even in terms of what their operations are on the ground or what their aims are on the ground are quite different. And I think that really is reflected in the way that women's roles have been reflected in each group.
Tasha again. Question out on the internet.
This is for Kristen Millen. She says that she's looking forward to reading your book in the near future. My question is, in this ever-changing landscape today, in regards to national security, how do you see women's roles needing to evolve? What are the biggest challenges going to be going forward?
Such a good question. There's three areas that are very much on my mind right now, and as young researchers or folks working in this space, I would highly encourage you to start looking at some of the big. She's referencing challenges. I'm looking at these as issues that we're kind of looking at right now, or that I think this book can really kind of inform further. But we're looking at, for example, the repatriation, the rehabilitation, the de-radicalization of a lot of folks that went over and joined ISIS right now, and thinking about how things like gender dynamics and specific responses that have to be adapted to women really have to be ingrained within that is a really important area looking forward. But we also see, for example, a global far-right movement and an uptick in far-right violence, and really thinking about, you know, again, we've had some really hard lessons learned in terms of how we understand women in that space, but also how we can have gender-conscious responses to these groups. And I don't think we're quite there yet. Women have very prominent roles in the far right as well. They have very diverse and active roles, and really understanding those. And when we're talking about gender, we're talking about men too, right? So understanding things like the role of masculinity and a masculine identity and what that means within that organization becomes something very important as well. And the third thing I would highlight is there's so many evolving fields right now, whether it's artificial intelligence, looking at new technologies, online space, strategic communications, areas where the roles of women or how these areas impact women has not been assessed at all. And I think there's a lot of potential to really dig into that a little bit more. If we're talking about challenges going forward, what I would say in particular response to counterterrorism work is really making a convincing argument and a long-term sustained and integrated counterterrorism policy and counterterrorism practice that consistently, holistically engages that gender lens and supports and recognizes the role of women, full stop. And I think that's still an uphill battle, but we're getting there. And one of the best ways I can see to really drive that is to demonstrate there's such a growing evidence base to support this, but women's roles matter in this space. They really matter for making operations more effective, more efficient. They reflect the needs of half that population, and in fact, it ensures that you do not violate the rights of women unintentionally in your operations when you better consider and assess them. So I think that's probably, it's that really making that convincing argument more widely recognized, how that actually positively impacts your day-to-day operations, and really ingraining that more systematically.
Other questions? Yeah. Ty.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. My name is Ty. I'm an alumnus of the Global Security Studies Master's Program. I have a question about your research. Can you talk about the FOIA process and any declassification you went through?
You know what? The glorious thing is that I did every single document I looked at was public access. And so I
Aren't
think
you lucky? As an intelligence historian, let me just say, aren't you lucky?
yeah, and you know what? I think once, like, if I would have had a chance to really get into some of the declassified stuff, you know, it just puts another layer in this story that would be a really interesting and important one to look at. But so what I was trying to do was I triangulated not only those primary source documents that were available in the public, but I was like scraping Department of Defense websites. It was scraping the State Department websites, going through their archives, going through their things that they had hosted historically. And there were such golden nuggets and, you know, different documents I would find that were just the way that things were being phrased or how women were being directly related to things like a counterterrorism program were so visible. But then also simultaneously doing those interviews to get a sense of not only what was being said in practice, but what did this actually look like, or what was being said on paper and policies, but what did this actually look like on the ground, and then talking to some of the actors that were actually implementing that. So I did try and kind of square that a little bit more, but I'm not sure how many documents I would have been able to get declassified at this stage, and that's actually something that I have not really looked into, but I would be so fascinating to go into more.
So that actually leads me to wonder about something I want to ask you. So at the CIA, which was not one of the agencies you looked at, but women played very prominent and very important roles in the counterterrorism effort. And there may be people either here or online who know more about this, but it's my understanding that a large part of that was because before 9/11, counterterrorism was not the sort of the high priority work, right? It was like, we'll shunt the women off to do this, and like, you know, we men will do the hard target stuff with the Russians and the Chinese and all that sort of stuff. And then when 9/11 happened, like, therefore it was women who like were sort of manning the front lines of this and were able to build on that. Mm-hmm. Is that a phenomenon sort of unique to CIA or the intelligence community, or were there analogous things going on with the CT world at DoD and at state?
You know, the intelligence community is such an interesting one because this is actually the one area of security that you look at where women in some cases are even a majority. And I find that to be a really interesting kind of puzzle, but the way that it seems to kind of jump out at me, and, you know, you can think about the Bin Laden analyst, or the unit that analyzed Bin Laden and eventually tracked him. You know, this was like majority women. Women have been very prominent in the intelligence community for decades, and, you know, this goes back to even women working in intelligence in the world wars, right? But I think the field of security has not been a generally welcoming place for women. Whether that's, you know, trying to crawl up and finally get access to things like combat roles, whether that means even getting into police forces, you know, the field of security when you're actually on the ground and practicing security has not generally been a welcoming place for women. And I think intelligence has provided one of these routes where women can and have been able to get involved in a way that has been more open to them. And I think it is because intelligence is viewed as a softer side of security. And if that means that there's been an access point to get more women involved, then that's been great. But simultaneously, if it's because women have been more limited or not viewed as relevant to or welcome in other spaces, then that's a problem.
Other questions? Tasha again. Those of you in the room need to step up here. The internet's excelling here.
This question is from Nat. He says he's currently a master's student at George Mason researching 5 female terrorist fighters that carried out attacks for ISIS. For example, Tasfeen Malik. Many of these women are radicalized online. How can women combat online radicalism?
Yeah, Tashfeen Malik is a really interesting one too, because she was the first female, as far as I'm aware, to conduct a mass casualty attack in the U.S. Of a jihadist nature. And you know what? Like, many of these women have been radicalized or influenced online. And I don't think it's necessarily, women shouldn't have to always be the ones engaging women. It doesn't matter if you're a male working in counter narratives or a woman working in strategic communications, but thinking about, it's about knowing your audience. It's about, if you're working in marketing, it's about understanding your audience and how you get your message across to the right audiences. And that means that it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman working in that space. You've got to understand what women in that community are thinking. What does a man think? What does a woman think? What might be attractive to them in different ways? And this goes down to things like, again, counter-narratives or countering radicalization online. That is something that I think not only women have to step up and be actors in that space, but actually this is something that really improves operations for men as well. And it does improve our security in our society when all of these actors are prevented from joining or supporting these ideologies. So I think it's important that both men and women working in that space get a sense of, again, what might draw men to an organization like that and what might draw women to an organization like that.
Go for it. Tasha again. Oh, I think it's off. If you can't get it on, you can tell me the question. I'll repeat it for the microphones if you like.
It said thank you for the event. It's almost 1 a.m. here. The question is, what is your opinion about female foreign fighters returning to their home countries, especially in regards for those who, in the case that they have children, who are passively or involuntarily involved?
So for the microphone, in case that wasn't audible online, I'm not sure. Somebody obviously joining us from Europe was asking about female fighters in return.
Yeah. Thanks for staying up, and I hope I hope it's been worth keeping you up past midnight. These populations that are currently sitting in places like Al-Hol camp, they're Canadian citizens, they're American citizens, they're European citizens, they are citizens from many, many countries around the world. And it is absolutely my position that these populations should be repatriated to their country of origin, prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and rehabilitated and reintegrated as appropriate. It has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And I'm talking about the adults here, right? These kids, many of them were either born over there, they were taken. We have to view children through the lens of victims here. And, some of the really interesting approaches that have been taken, or that I think can really inform this space, is we've dealt with child soldiers for years. We've dealt with children in gangs. We've dealt with children in cults. There is a lot of really excellent work that's been done in that space that can inform how we can best support and rehabilitate these kids that have had experiences that no child should ever go through. When we look at the cases of adults, they're very complex, they're very diverse, but in cases where prosecution is possible, they should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And where possible, even criminals that go through our justice system in other cases do get a chance to rehabilitate and reintegrate. And this is something that it's very, terrorism is it's viewed as very exceptional in our societies. But in terms of long-term prevention and long-term management of these populations, we can't just leave them over there forever, full stop. So I think it is important that we do proactively take those efforts to manage these populations as we best see fit.
So you talked there about children, and you talked about adults, but of course this has been going on long enough that there's an alarmingly large category of young women, and for that matter, young men, who went when they were unambiguously children and who are now adults. Like, how do we think about policy towards them?
Yeah, I think Shamima Begum is probably the poster girl for this transition, right? She went over when she was 16 years old with 2 other fellow schoolgirls from London, and was viewed as a victim in the sense, a schoolgirl that's been kind of duped into going. She's since had 3 children. She married a jihadist husband and is now in Al-Hol camp after having lost these 3 children, and seems to still portray a kind of affinity for ISIS. It's a complex case, and it presents a very difficult set of circumstances. But again, in cases where, as an adult, they have been implicated in some kind of criminal activity, there's something demonstrable that they've done, all of that has to be accounted for in things like their sentencing, the prosecution, and the kind of, again, things like rehabilitation and de-radicalization that might be required for them. But, I think there's got to be a bit of nuance in how we approach what might have been a younger girl that may have been coerced into going over, or, again, might have gone over for diverse circumstances than somebody who was maybe an adult and fully understood the implications of their actions going over, picking up a gun and heading to the front lines.
Well, since you mentioned Begum, we were talking about her before the
Yeah.
event. You want to just remind us what her current status is?
Yeah, so Shamim Begum has currently had her citizenship stripped, her British citizenship.
And she was born in
stripped.
Britain.
She was born in Britain. There is an argument that she has access to Bangladeshi citizenship, which she does not currently hold, and so there's been a back and forth legal battle on her status. But what's really been interesting is that we've seen so many men go over and either die on the battlefield. We're not talking 1,000 or 2,000. We're talking tens of thousands of males that have died on the battlefield over there. A population of women that's largely been unable to leave that area. And when we have seen returnees, our research demonstrated that a majority of these returnees were men. And so actually, when we look at the populations currently being held in Syria and Iraq, a majority of those are women and minors. And so it's interesting because I think that there's also a bit of a sentiment that because they're associated with ISIS, they should be, I think that some of the brunt of the grievance against ISIS, very rightfully so, by populations that have suffered under ISIS, a lot of that is being directed in ways at these women and minors in particular, in ways that are, in the long term, very unhelpful for how we actually deal with these problems and actually provide justice to those that have suffered under ISIS.
I think we've got time for one more. Anybody else have Yeah, over here. Is the microphone functioning, or have we given up on that? If we've
Okay,
all right.
Thanks again for being here. My name's Oliver. I'm a student in the Master's in Government program. My question was that you've mentioned a couple times about how important it is to kind of look at counterterrorism problems through this gender lens.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like an important part of being able to do that is having women in lots of different roles. But I'm an active duty officer in the Coast Guard, and it's been a challenge for us to retain women in the service a long period of time and get them into higher ranks. So I'm curious if in your research you've dealt with other organizations that have done a good job or done a better job with retaining women in different roles, and what you've seen have been successful strategies.
Just in case that wasn't picked up on the AV well, so the question was about retention of women in government service and in the Coast Guard and other analogous organizations.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great question, and I guess there's 2 points. I think just the presence of women in and of itself is not necessarily the answer to everything. I think it's important to have your population full stop reflected in your security services, whether that's police, whether that's military. Having forces reflective of your population means you've got the most representative and robust force that you can have. And so I think that's one thing. It's not just to kind of add women and stir, but also but simultaneously, a lot of these departments or agencies, I think, for a long time have been viewed as kind of not off limits, but unwelcoming to women. And so some of that does have to do with the kind of institutional cultures and what can be done institutionally, not only to attract women and say that you can have a career here and you can have a very rewarding career within this area, but also institutionally what is being done to support women that are already in there. And so, for example, just randomly today, I had a chance to run into a 30-year veteran of the military who was out near the Vietnam War Memorial that focused on women here. And she was talking about all of the changes she's seen over the years. And I think, again, something that she highlighted was that even veteran care has to be much more tailored to women, or, there does have to be consideration of some of the institutional mechanisms to support and retain women that I think is still kind of lacking. But yeah, institutionally, how do you change that kind of culture to make it more attractive for very diverse populations, including women? But once they're actually in those, how can you retain them with things that might be a bit more flexible to some of the needs of what a contemporary family or what a contemporary population looks like?
Well, Joanna, I want to thank you for coming here and talking with us about this really interesting book and this work you've done. Let's have a round of applause for Dr. Joanna Cook. And thank you also for teaching for us. We really appreciate it, and I know your students do as well. This wouldn't be Washington if we didn't add to your challenge coin collection, which I know you're building. So thank you so
Yes.
much, and also a Johns Hopkins pen, which hopefully you can use in your office back in London.
Fantastic.
And equally important, for those of you who don't have it, I'd encourage you to get a hold of this book. And everybody who's got their copy here, I'm sure she'll be glad to sign them for you. And thank you so much again. I think
Thanks
we're
for coming
adjourned.
out tonight and for your questions.